Michael Salvartsis has been a property valuer for over 20 years. He's recently made the switch to being a buyer's agent for real property buyers. Michael brings a unique skill set to any discussion on property. Mike, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks for having me.
For once and for all, Mike, are valuers conservative?
I think, to be fair and balanced, the general perception is probably yes.
By members of the public?
By members of the public. I think when you look at the rules and regulations that valuers are effectively operating under, then I think you might have a slightly different thought around that or process around that. For example, the governing bodies, the governing valuation bodies, they effectively do not allow valuers to use settled sales in valuation reports. So effectively, if a property is exchanged, say we were doing a valuation as at today, if a property exchanged within the last 6 weeks, that sale would not be able to be used in the valuation process. Now the other thing, the rules and requirements around valuations, for instance, banks, a small majority of banks actually instruct valuers to complete formal internal inspections. Most of valuations are actually completed by banks or valuers at a desktop level. So a desktop level by nature has to be fairly conservative, but when you look at it in terms of the internal inspections, most of the valuations that banks instruct would be at loan to valuation ratios that are well in excess of 75%. So that is a much more riskier assessment, and to some instance, maybe even an insurance policy for a bank.
So valuers are coming at the valuation process from a different perspective in comparison with home buyers and home sellers then?
Yes, they are. They are. And I think for any basis of understanding what the property's current market value is, the valuation should be used as a tool and a basis to enable negotiations, to enable local knowledge, etc.
Yeah. Look, residential real estate is emotional. How do you price a view? What's a car park worth versus a terrace without a car park, for example? Therefore, should vendors get an independent valuation prior to going on the market, Mike?
Especially in markets that are volatile. For instance, an increasing market or a declining market. What is the property worth? A valuer is an independent, certified expert. My advice when vendors are using the valuation is that they should not just call for a valuation on the assessment of the property. They should be calling for a lot of other facts to be addressed in that valuation report. For instance, what repairs are necessary? And if we carry out those repairs, how much value will it potentially add to the property? Secondly, valuers should be commenting on the best method of sale, whether it be private treaty, auction, expression of interest. Thirdly, timing. Timing in property is critical. So there's no point listing a property in December to be sold at auction at the end of December. What you've got to do is you look at where your supply is, where your demand is, and the other thing that valuers, I believe, should be commenting on is also who the most likely buyer is. Whether
Buyer
it be,
profile.
Yeah, in terms of whether it be an owner-occupier, an investor, a developer.
When doing a valuation or trying to assess value, is it best to factor in, or is it allowed that you're allowed to factor in future events such as economic environment, interest rate movements, for example, or is a valuation all about the here and now today?
Valuers are not economists, and they shouldn't be expected to be. Neither are buyers agents nor selling agents.
Big point.
Basically, we can't predict interest rate movements. We can't predict the Australian dollar movement. We can't predict unemployment levels. So every transaction or every thought to purchase a property, you should basically buy that property at the best price that you potentially can.
And sell it for the best price that you
Exactly,
can.
and that's after consideration of what the value of that asset is.
Yeah.
And when you buy that property, based on what you believe the value of that asset is today, you should factor in potential interest rate increases and the ability to repay mortgages.
What are the common mistakes that you see buyers make?
Some of the most common mistakes that we see buyers making when they're not using reputable buyers agents or they're not conversant with the market is the lack of research. So
buying on impulse and emotion?
Buying on impulse. They would not know where the last sales transacted. They wouldn't have been to auctions. They wouldn't have inspected properties. They may not have finance approval or written finance approval. For instance, they may not have commissioned a pest and building report. They may not have spent that money, if it was a unit, for example, to do a strata report. Buyers generally also do not factor the total cost of the acquisition. The property purchase doesn't stop and end with a purchase price.
Certainly not.
And in addition to that, there's incidental costs. For instance, there's stamp duty, which can be a significant component. There's cost of getting mortgages. There's also cost of commissioning pest and building reports, strata reports. A lot of buyers come to me and they haven't factored in all these incidental costs. So the first thing we do is we basically go back and say, you know, you don't have a clear understanding of what the total cost is going to be for this acquisition. So you've either got to reduce your purchase price, or you've got to obtain that approval that factors in all those incidental costs that we've discussed.
So going to a buyer's agent can help a buyer avoid a mistake rather than fixing a mistake.
Buyer's agents are on the ground 6 days a week.
Yes.
They're inspecting numerous properties. They are attending auctions. They have access to on-market properties and off-market properties. The only way to understand whether you're buying well as a buyer is to pretty much take on the role of a buyer's agent. Now, when people are time poor, which is a segment of our marketplace that we service every day, they effectively need to leave it in the hands of specialists.
And the off-market transactions risen enormously across Sydney in the last 2 years, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has. And with off-markets, you need to tread carefully. Not all off-markets are priced at market levels.
Well, the vendor's obviously at a point there where they say, we'll only sell off-market if we get a really strong price.
And that's a portion of it.
Yes.
Part of the off-market stock that we look at is overpriced, so we don't recommend it to our clients. But part of it is very reasonably priced. And the reason is because vendors may have different circumstances or situations. They need to transact to move on to the next one.
As a buyer's agent, Mike, in negotiations, where do you see that vendors and vendors' agents get it wrong?
Vendors' agents, their livelihood is based on commissions, right? So closing a transaction quickly is what every selling agent wants to do. Now, whether that's in the best interest of the owner remains questionable. The other thing that I find that vendors' agents, and I've had a recent example of this, where we've put in an offer on a property. 4 times I've received a phone call from this vendor's agent telling me that there are other buyers around. Now, this is about 2.5 weeks ago. So those other buyers, if they're around, why is this agent calling me, telling me to still buy the property?
You only get away with bluffing once at the poker table. So false deadlines, high pressure tactics, trying to railroad the buyer into a decision, and then it becomes quickly and apparent to the buyer that there isn't the interest that the selling agent's
One thing
claiming
I've learnt about real estate, in essence, providing artificial deadlines or indicating that there are other competing buyers out there who will exchange if we don't exchange. All these things come to some sort of situation when it's crunch time.
Last week I had dinner with some people that sold a property with me, and we had dinner with the people that bought the property. And I said at the start of the dinner to both parties, I said, this is why as a real estate agent you never tell lies.
Yeah, very much so.
You never know when your buyer and your seller are going to come together.
Yeah, very much so.
Mike, in 2018, what's the best advice you can give to property investors?
There are signs that we are seeing that there will be more stock on the market in 2018 rather than 2017. So I think the dynamics have changed. You know, remember, we've come off a strong selling market where clearance rates were pretty much handling anywhere from 75 to about 85%. Those fundamentals have changed. We're now probably at around 60 to 65%. That to me is a balanced market. That means that buyers and sellers pretty much balance out. The key thing for me is to be conversant, do your research, which is critical. Make sure you buy the right property at the right price. Make sure that you're conversant with market value. Make sure that you have the ability and comfort to be able to service interest rate increases. Make sure that you, for instance, my philosophy is to stay away from brand new product. brand new unit markets or unit product because they're untried markets. So what you'd want to do is stay within the established markets. Want to make sure that once again your finance approval is in writing and relevant. That is probably the biggest obstacle in this marketplace at the moment.
It's quickly become that.
Yeah. And you know, there's no longer interest-only loans available amongst the primary lenders. So in any situation, if you're an investor who bought hoping to service on an interest-only situation, those dynamics have changed.
Yes.
You need the capacity to be able to repay both principal and interest.
Yeah. Excellent information, Mike. The only thing I'd add for investors there in 2018 is I think you need a longer term view than what we've seen in the last few years. Residential property in Sydney's been pretty exciting in the last 5 years, where you can buy a property on January 1 and you know it's going to be worth more on December 31.
Yep.
And over the next few years, I think we're going to see flat markets, and investors certainly need to take a long-term perspective. And if they do happen to stumble on a short-term gain, that's good management. But I think setting out for quick gains in the property market is not the place to be playing in 2018.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree. And I don't think that just applies to investors. It also applies to owner-occupiers.
Yes.
Property is not a short-term strategy, and decisions around property should be long-term.
Even though people have made short-term gains in recent times.
Yeah, those short-term gains have been made, and it could be timing, it could be luck, it could be knowing something that the market generally doesn't know.
Correct.
So there will always be those situations, but for the majority that will not apply.
Terrific information, Mike. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Peter.
And thanks for watching Talking Property. We'll see you next time.